Hello.
Hello.
Hey, Amy. Hello, everyone that's listening. Thank you for joining us again for another Empathy Power Up, where we take 15 minutes and give you a little power up for the week, for the break, and we talk about various topics through the lens of empathy. I'm Kevin Shaw, and with me is the amazing my co-host Amy J. Wilson. By now, y'all should sort of get to know us. But this last month, we focused on feeling seen and heard, which is very powerful and incredible. And this month in October, we're talking about generational trauma. And there's a lot to break down there, but today we're gonna focus a little bit about trauma and tee off a little bit about generational trauma and then talk about some of those aspects. Amy, I would love to start. You've been sort of diving deep into this space more and more, and you wrote about it in your book. And I would love to hear first. Let's start just breaking down what understanding trauma.
Absolutely. And I think this is a good place for us to start because I think, this word is almost overused, this idea of like trauma in one way or another. But I really just wanted to get to brass tacks about like what does it mean? Because this will provide a great foundation for the work that we're going to be doing in like subsequent weeks for
Mhm.
October. Because we can, I've got some like exciting like thoughts when it comes to the work that we're doing when we talk about generational trauma, but let's just break it down first into like the components of trauma. So the American Psychological Association says that trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, a sexual assault, or a natural disaster. So a person can experience trauma as a response to anything that is like physically or emotionally threatening or harmful, right? So it doesn't have to be one of those things. It can be like, you just had a bad day, right? But in like a deep way where it really affects you. I've had those days where it's like there's different levels of trauma that happens, or if you've broken your leg, that's thought of as a trauma. So there's three different kinds of trauma that are out there. We've got acute trauma, which is something from a single incident. We've got chronic trauma, which is repeated and prolonged, such as like domestic abuse or just abuse in general. And then there's complex trauma, which is when you're exposed to various and multiple traumatic events, often as in an invasive interpersonal nature. So our bodies have this idea of like trauma and it's stored in our bodies, which we will talk about a little bit more in subsequent weeks. But there's usually four different kinds of responses when we have a traumatic experience that our body cannot tackle. And a lot of people probably have heard of fight, flight, or freeze. So you're going to fight what's happening. You're going to fly away and run, or you're going to freeze in place and just be like, I don't know what to do, and you just let it happen. One that I think is lesser known trauma response is that we're related to people pleasing. And I think this is one that's a little bit more common, I think. And if you're around toxic people, you try to make that person happy, right? It happens a lot in the workplace in particular. You just let that toxic person kind of just like take over because you don't want to fight. So Kevin, do you have any
Yeah.
like
Oh my God.
experiences with that or have
Oh
heard
my goodness.
about it?
So I'll just tee off with like my opinion, and I believe that most people experience trauma, and not experiencing trauma is a privilege, and that in a way that's a good thing. I'm not saying is it a negative. I think it's a good thing. That means you've been surrounded by parents that are amazing, or are focused on protecting, and you've gone through it. But a lot of us experience trauma in our lives. I've experienced most of those that you've listed. As a young child, I was in a motorcycle accident, so I had traumatic brain injuries, and I've had lots of physical accidental traumas from those experiences. In college, I was abused by some students and graduate students, and
Mm,
overnight for a prank that I had pulled, and so that was a big moment in my life. That traumatic incident that sort of impacted me where they literally they put me in an apartment and made me do confessional videos and things like that. It was ridiculous. It was really, and then beat me up. But
gosh,
more recently, the trauma that I think is more applicable to our LinkedIn community and the professional I work is the one you talked about at the end, which was about pleasing people and the trauma and the abuse we face. And everything you said in one of my previous roles, I worked in a company where I loved it. I enjoyed the culture. I loved it. And then I got a new leadership, new boss. And just like that, it went, literally it was overnight, where it went from, this is a place I love, to holy shit, this is a place where I feel inept. I feel I am not, like, years of promotions and special comps and all these things, and suddenly overnight it's changed. And the abuse was like, I would get phone calls from my boss and be like, you better talk like this, or that is the only response I expect from you. And that's the kind of abuse that I went through. And on the surface, there are these people are amazing. They smile, they come across as the most friendly people, but incredibly toxic. And you notice the entire culture changed to people pleasing that person in top.
Yeah.
And it's like, all right, this is the new boss. And even though they talk about how toxic the culture is, that still continues on, because they know they can't change that. It's not like they can change it, because that's what they believe. And so a lot of us, and especially in workforce, and I see that very often and still see it, toxic behaviors are seen as the behaviors that are needed in workforce, and even if it is intentional or unintentional, it still exists. And that trauma, I experienced it. And yes, last week was a big moment when my boss was, like, former boss was fired. And I believe it was for abuse. I believe it was for abuse, because that was a lot of people. There were a lot of victims of that abuse that person did. But it re-triggered my trauma, and I had a really shitty week because it was that bad. Like, I was at the point of suicidal and depression when I was working there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing that, first of all. And it makes me feel like a lot of times in my workplaces, I felt like I had to walk on eggshells, right? And I couldn't really be truly myself, because I was trying to, be people please the people around me, right? And I think that's a pervasive thing, and that's one of the reasons why we're talking about it today. And so, I think what is important to kind of like bring this whole trauma conversation together, I think, like you were saying in the workplace, is that, like, I think we're having a better understanding of what this is, an awakening of sorts. I talk about it in the book, where we are starting to say, like, oh, this is not okay, right? And what is also interesting that I've been diving deeper into, and I'm diving further into my practice this week, is around some healing that I'm going to be doing with it. But some of it has to do with, like, generational trauma, and that's the theme for the month. And it's lesser known as well. It's so an impact of, like, a traumatic experience can be passed on from generation to generation. Some people call it transgenerational trauma, but it's things like parental incarceration, divorce, right? Alcohol use disorder, drug use, domestic violence, child abuse, natural disasters. So if you've gone through, Hurricane Katrina, or, wildfire is a natural disaster, right? And so those are different traumas that you have, and you can pass it on.
Yep.
And what's interesting and insidious about this is that this type of trauma usually goes unrecognized. So it allows the cycle to continue through each generation. And so intergenerational trauma can show up, like, with low self-esteem, depression, anxiety, insomnia, anger, and also self-destructive behaviors that you have. So, in the adult children of alcoholics groups that I'm in the room of with my own childhood existence, with my father being an alcoholic, there is there's self-destructive behaviors that I've inherited and I learned, right? So maladaptive behaviors. So I'm trying to understand that, and where that came from. I look at my dad's past. But I think when I think in the terms of intergenerational trauma, something that hits me deep is the story of my mother's side. Of the family. I think I've told you about this, but for the larger audience here, I have my grandmother. I'm first generation American. My grandmother, her name we would call her Babsha, which is grandmother in Ukrainian. She was Ukrainian and Catholic, and her name was oh gosh, Maria was her name, and she was survived 2 concentration camps in World War II. And she was in 17 when the Gestapo took her from her life in Lvov, Ukraine, to the concentration camp of Ravensbrück. And she spent time in Ravensbrück and Buchenwald. And during that time, obviously, immense, traumas that happened to her on a daily basis, I'm sure. And then the camp was liberated. My mother was born in this refugee camp where she was born into kind of like traumatic experiences. Then they come to Baltimore. My mother eventually, they settle in Baltimore. They have, my grandmother has 2 other children from another man. And then by around the time my mom was 7 or 8, my grandmother is diagnosed with schizophrenia, and then is taken away. My mother is taken away. She's put in an orphanage. My grandmother is now in a mental institution, and like we didn't have a really big understanding of PTSD and understanding of how these systems affect us. And so in a way, like it was just kind of like a blanket, like diagnosis of schizophrenia when she was in her 30s. And so, talk about that being traumatic too, being taken away from your mother. And so many years later, when my mom is in her 30s, she's diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, which is a debilitating disease. It's a neurological disease. Actually your nervous system is affected by it, and most people test positive for it. My mom has a pretty severe form of it, but my mom never tested positive. So at the end of the day, like I get the sense, like this trauma that my grandmother went through was passed on in some way to my mother, right? Where that's my sisters and I are all convinced of that fact, and having this condition, right, and where she grew up with her own trauma. And then on my side, I have anxiety and depression that I got from both sides of the family, and also CPTSD, complex PTSD, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the next session or two. But all these things are just like, I look, and when I started doing this healing work that I've been doing, I've been looking at that generational nature and being like, oh, it's not me, it's the system. It's the things that have been passed on from generation to generation. And so in a way, it takes away the shame and blame of like, there's something wrong with me, to being like, there's something wrong with maybe how the world works.
Yeah, so thanks for sharing that story. Very powerful, very impactful. And I wanted to point out, like, one thing is, yes, I'm so glad you talked about it as a system, even though we get better. So one thing I do think is every generation, parenting and techniques and tools are getting better. So we're hoping that this keeps going. So that's optimistic. That's great. But at the same time, people, like, generational trauma doesn't always show up in the way it showed up in your story as well. Like you said, like parents beating their children, and then those children beating their children. And like in my case, my mother and my grandfather and everyone, there was a lot of just, that was how you discipline people, how you kids. And so it came to me, and that is another form of generation trauma that's passed down, where your parents beat you, and that was a thing people used to say proudly, oh, spanking your children is a good thing, right? And that is the system. It wasn't like the parents believed, it was just that's what the system was. And so by highlighting these things, our hope is that we can start recognizing it and then putting it at a stop so that we can systemically change like we did. I do think that the world has come quite a bit far from not beating their children, especially in United States. It's still prevalent in a lot of developing countries, a lot of other places. In India, it still has to go through. But these are examples of generational trauma that sort of get passed on, like divorce, you said, like parents having a bad relationship. If they don't get along and they constantly keep fighting, you grew up watching that potentially affects your relationships with people.
Yeah. And that can turn into complex trauma, right? Or complex PTSD. So we'll go into it further. We're already at time, but I think to sum this all up, I think the reason why this topic appeals to both you and me, obviously, is because we have it in our past and we're healing from it. But understanding our trauma can help us unlock our internal well-being to see how we show up and our internal workings, right? And we have and how our brain makes us react to the world. And I've been going deep in this world as far as like, really, how was your reptilian response? The one that you were built, you were like grown to have, is affecting you and your body and how you react to things. So understanding a trauma helps us to slow down and also better respond to the things that are around us. And that is the perfect foundation for us to keep practicing empathy. You talk about the empathy gym. Until we start healing our traumas and understanding how our bodies are showing up with each other, we can't move into a place from hurting to healing and to helping. And so, I talk about the head, the heart, the hand. It's to moving to a place where we can take someone's perspective, we can feel their feelings, and also be willing to help each other if needed. And you can do it for yourself, right? Through the healing.
So what a great way to start this month, to dive in deeper into a hard topic, but we all sort of face it. We are aligned to. I invite all of y'all for a call to action, is reflect about your experiences growing up. What are some things that might be fit within this category as we dive deeper into this month? So with that, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Take care, everybody. Catch you next week.